I'm Cami Ryan. I'm a social scientist. Social sciences is a broad umbrella term, and it covers a number of disciplines across the humanities and the liberal arts. Cognitive neuroscience, psychology, economics, law, sociology, rhetorics, communication. What social scientists like me are interested in is basically we're interested in relationships. Relationships between people and their environment, between people and organizations. What I'm really interested in is I'm interested in the relationship between people and farming and food production and the science behind farming and food production. We have never been more geographically or generationally removed from the farm. So few of us have that farming memory, as I call it, or an understanding of how our food is produced. And when we're not as connected with something or we're not as close to something, we can be easily influenced by misinformation around that particular thing. So I'm very interested in understanding what drives people's perceptions and behaviors around farming and food production and getting to the bottom of those questions. In the early 1990s, I worked for a small plant biotech company up in Canada, and what we were doing at the time is we were cloning plant material for orchard development in Western Canada. We also did mine reclamation work, introducing native habitat back into some of the disturbed sites. Another interesting project that we did is we grew herbs and roses and pharmaceutical plants 1,000 feet below the surface of the earth in an abandoned mine drift. So that was the early 90s. My career evolved from there, so did my research. I ultimately got a PhD in interdisciplinary studies from the University of Saskatchewan. And it was a blend. It was a blend of business psychology, sociology, and agricultural economics. In my work, I was really interested in the relationships between scientists. I wanted to know, how did they work and how did they play together? How did those relationships impact their work together as scientists and the projects that they worked on? I conducted hundreds of interviews with a number of really interesting scientists in the agricultural field. Something that I really figured out that was very interesting is I found a tool called social network analysis where I can really kind of quantify what these relationships were like. Social network analysis is a way of quantitatively analyzing network ties amongst a group of people or organizations or people in organizations. It's really cool stuff. You can use it as a tool for examining things like, say, mergers and acquisitions in any field or any industry. You can use social network analysis to evaluate pandemic networks like we're kind of living through right now. My research evaluating networks of scientists evolved a lot. It grew to include looking at global networks of plant breeders. I wanted to understand, how do these plant breeders connect? How do they share their expertise, their knowledge, and in some cases their materials, their germplasm? So let's look at 2009. Things got a little interesting for me then. A genetically engineered flax was found in stores of flax in the European Union. That whole thing sent me on a 4-year journey of trying to figure out and map how this issue came to be. You see, there was no genetically engineered flax on the market at all at that time. Is that the genetically engineered flax that they found actually had been developed at one point, but it never made it to the market. But guess what? It had passed through food and feed safety approvals in Canada, the US, and it was on its way in the UK when it was withdrawn from the market years before 2009. So this whole thing created a huge controversy in the market and in terms of public perceptions and opinion about GMOs. So it got me to wondering, why are so many people so freaked out about food production and agriculture? And especially about genetically modified organisms. The long story short is that work led me to my current job. I currently work for a global company that engages in healthcare and agriculture. I work in the Regulatory Scientific Affairs Organization. What we do here is you guys, I am lead social scientist for a multinational healthcare and agricultural company. I work with a multidisciplinary team of experts: animal scientists, cell biologists, plant geneticists, medical doctors, toxicologists, Our job is to address some of these more complex scientific and social issues that are going on out there. This is where we ensure that our products meet legislative requirements and that we deliver safe and valuable technologies that farmers can use in their operations. Why does a social scientist work for a company like this? Do you know what scientific consensus means? Scientific consensus is the collective judgment or opinion of a community of scientists working in an area of study. But here's the deal, and this is why I work for the company I do. Scientific consensus does not always mean social consensus. Even if the scientists in a specific area of study all agree on something, it doesn't mean that society, that people like you and me, really agree with it. Maybe we don't like the technology. Maybe we don't want that kind of science. So let's go back a bit. I'm going to tell you how I got here today, to this place in my life. I was raised in Western Canada. My grandparents immigrated into Canada at the turn of the last century, broke ground on their farm decades and decades and decades ago. So I remember my grandmother talking about the farm. It's my connection to the farm. But I always grew up in a farming community. Farming was a big part of our daily lives. If we weren't farming, our neighbors were farming. The kids that I went to school with were farmers or came from farming families. In fact, the biggest city I've ever lived in had a population of 250,000. I'm pretty much a small town prairie girl. That's how I identify. Remember how I mentioned earlier that scientific consensus doesn't always mean social consensus? Just because the science says something is good doesn't mean that society necessarily wants it. We see examples of this all the time. Well, there are some really good technologies out there, and they're probably being unfairly judged. Let me tell you why. There's a couple of things that really influence public opinion, and that is the media, and it is social media. Did you know that by the year 2023, more than 3 billion people will be on social media platforms? Social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter have become the virtual social living rooms of our lives. This is where we connect as human beings, this is where we talk, and this is where we share information. But guess what? That information isn't always accurate. That a lot of that information, that misinformation, can really drive public perceptions and public opinions about important technologies and products. For example, GMO seeds. GMO seeds have the capacity to really improve the way farmers grow food. They can really help smallholder farmers in developing countries as well. That's where they might have the most impact, in fact. We can't operate in this business, no matter what area of agriculture you work in, without understanding all of these factors that come into play and how they influence public opinion about agriculture and food production. The social media landscape and the media in general, and how it portrays agriculture. So I'm really interested in this because this feeds into how people view science, and it feeds into that relationship that society has with science. And the big takeaway that I've learned from all of this and my experiences so far in the last 3 decades working in agriculture, I've really learned that if we know something, we need to share this information. So if we're plant geneticists or if we're farmers or if we're social scientists in agriculture, our knowledge, our expertise is our privilege. We have a moral obligation to share that, especially in times when disinformation is being shared so widely. The great thing about farmers in particular is because they have the best human interest stories about food and agriculture. They're the ones working the front line. They're the ones that are growing our food. You know, I love my job. I've had a truly colorful and lively career as a social scientist. Being a social scientist in ag means that you work with such a wide variety of individuals all across the agricultural value chain, that I get to dig into the most amazing pieces of this field, understanding how agriculture can help mitigate climate change, understanding public perceptions of science, and being part of the process, ensuring that the best products make it to societies that need them. But I guess the best part of my whole job is I get to work with so many people across agriculture, and that includes farmers. And don't tell anyone, but farmers are my favorite. Hey, if you have any questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them. Thanks for listening in.